Augustine did not yet expound a doctrine of progress in our modern sense. He left no place for novelty, for the unexpected good. Still, he foreshadowed an idea of progress, of hope for a better life on earth. The Roman Empire, he said, had brought the world together so that Jesus Christ might be born into it, and to provide the church its opportunity for universal dominion. To Augustine, a cyclical theory of history was inconceivable, even abhorrent, for it would deny the uniqueness of Jesus Christ and the promise of his gospel. In his Confessions, he records his personal struggle against, quote, the lying divinations and impious dotages of the astrologers, end of quote, who taught that the pattern of events was repetitive, determined by the returning cycles of celestial arrangement. Some of the most eloquent passages of the City of God attacked the pagan theory of cycles, circuitus temporum. Quote, those arguments whereby the infidel seeks to undermine our simple faith, dragging us from the straight road and compelling us to walk with him on the wheel, end of quote. He warns us not to misinterpret the wisdom of King Solomon in Ecclesiastes. Quote, the thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun, end of quote. And quote, far be it from the true faith that by these words of Solomon we should believe are meant those cycles by which they, the pagan philosophers, suppose that the same revolutions of times and of temporal things are repeated, so that, as one might say, just as in this age the philosopher Plato sat in the city of Athens and in the school called Academy teaching his pupils, so also through countless ages of the past, at intervals both the same Plato in the same city and the same school and the same pupils have been repeated as they are destined to be repeated through countless ages of the future. God forbid, I say, that we should swallow such nonsense. Christ died once and for all for our sins, end of quote. The other church fathers, too, read the prophecies of the Old Testament not as a vision of cycles, but as a forecast of the uniqueness of Jesus Christ. The prophecy in Genesis of the coming of a leader who, quote, shall be the expectation of the nations, could refer only to Jesus. Quote, he was obviously the only one, Origen wrote in Alexandria some 2 centuries before Augustine, among all his predecessors and among posterity as well, who was the expectation of the nations, end of quote. Jesus Christ had taken mankind off the quote-unquote wheel. The finality of Jesus, elaborated by Augustine into a theory of history, would govern Christian thought in Europe for the next 1,000 years. While Christianity would be justified in history, its truths could not grow, but were simply fulfilled. To the Jewish view of the past, the Christians added their own sacred texts. The New Testament, they said, fulfilled the prophecies of the Old. Both scriptures together were the one God's revelations, not merely for a chosen people, but for all mankind. While the Gospels were good news for everyone, they were not history in the Greek sense of inquiry, but were verifications of faith. They were both the end and the beginning. The Christian test was a willingness to believe in the one Jesus Christ and his message of salvation. What was demanded was not criticism, but credulity. The church fathers observed that in the realm of thought, only heresy had a history. When the literate leaders of Christianity made their record, they were not interested in inquiry. They had no need to seek answers. They had only to document them. During the Christian centuries in Europe, these best minds in the church developed their own techniques for using the past. Origen, around 185 to 254, the precocious Alexandrian Greek, at the age of 18 became the head of the leading Christian theological academy there, and reputedly wrote some 800 works. Because he had castrated himself to ensure his purity, he could not be ordained as a priest, but his teachings made him the most influential theologian before St. Augustine. A genius at allegory, he even managed to discern the outlines of Christianity in the writings of the Greeks, and so gave Christianity the aura of antiquity without endangering faith by historical skepticism. Quote, "If the law of Moses had contained nothing which was to be understood as having a sacred meaning," Origen observed, "the prophet would not have said in his prayer to God, 'Open thou mine eyes, and I will behold wondrous things out of thy law.'" End of quote. When the Mediterranean world began to take up this new religion and the events of Jesus' life receded into the past, it was necessary not only to foresee Jesus in the scriptures of the Jews, but to place all events of the Bible and the acts of early Christians in the context of the world. This was accomplished by Origen's brilliant successor, Eusebius of Caesarea, AD circa 260 to 340, who sat at the right hand of Emperor Constantine and delivered the opening eulogy of the emperor at the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. For the first time, his chronology arranged and encompassed the events of the Chaldean, Greek, and Roman past into the framework of the Bible. Eusebius provincialized the history of the whole world into a history of Christianity. His calendar of world events managed to incorporate and yet excommunicate the whole non-Christian past. Quote, "Other writers of history record the victories of war and trophies won from enemies, the skill of generals, and the manly bravery of soldiers, defiled with blood and with innumerable slaughters for the sake of children and country and other possessions. But our narrative of the government of God will record in ineffaceable letters the most peaceful wars waged in behalf of the peace of the soul, and will tell of men doing brave deeds for truth rather than country, and for piety rather than dearest friends. It will hand down to imperishable remembrance the discipline and the much-tried fortitude of the athletes of religion, the trophies won from demons, the victories over invisible enemies, and the crowns placed upon all their heads." End of quote. The next centuries produced some great works of theology, a copious hagiography of, quote, "the athletes of religion." But for 1,000 years, the spirit of historical inquiry, foreshadowed in Herodotus and Thucydides, would lie dormant. Christian scholars would share Eusebius' faith in, quote, "the incontrovertible words of the Master to his disciples. It is not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father has put in his own power." End of quote. The Christian vision of the past enveloped ancient documents in a haze of allegory and recent actors in an aureole of holiness. History became a footnote to orthodoxy. During the next 10 centuries in Europe, there were scattered experiments in seeking Christian uses of the past, but they created no tradition of historical inquiry. St. Augustine did use data from the past to document his city of God. The 7 books of histories against the pagans by his disciple Orosius in 5th century AD demonstrated that the evils of post-Christian times could not be blamed on the religion of Christ, for earlier times had suffered even worse calamities. Among the occasional escapees from the prison of Christian orthodoxy were some, such as the Englishman, the Venerable Bede, 673 to 735, who oblige us by incorporating at length the documents of their time. Meanwhile, the compilers of annals like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle noted the acts of kings and the careers of churches and monasteries, but the raw materials of history were not history. The early efforts to create a national past for rudimentary nations sometimes followed the pattern of the Aeneid. Like Virgil's founders of Rome, other founders elsewhere had been divinely guided. Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, circa 1150, traced the descent of British kings back to the Trojans. Glimmers of modern historical inquiry were found in a few works written by men of affairs. Einhard, companion and advisor of Charlemagne, drew a lively portrait of his hero. Otto, Bishop of Freising, grandson of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, was close enough to the throne to give us an intimate glimpse of his nephew Frederick Barbarossa. Still, the full and free exploration of the past was impossible as long as the written record remained above criticism. Sacred authors had become authorities, and medieval chroniclers preferred authorities to experience. When the Venerable Bede wrote about Hadrian's Wall, which still stood within sight of where he lived and which he passed every day, instead of describing what he saw, he preferred to quote a Roman writer. And this concludes Chapter 70. Thanks for listening.